We can't change what's been done, but it's still our run. We are one with the world. We can make a brighter tomorrow. Together make a change. It's our life. We can't step back from what we know is right. So let's shine our light.
Хорошо, можно.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session on the future of philanthropic media. My name is Charlotte Kilpatrick. I'm the digital editor at Alliance Magazine, and I am very lucky to be joined today by 4 fellow journalists who also cover philanthropy. So our first one joining us from Barcelona, we have Michael Cavate, who is a senior editor at Philanthropy Age. I am also joined by Louise Redvers, the managing editor of Circle and Philanthropy Age from Dubai, and from Bert Koopman, who is the editor-in-chief of philanthropy platform DDB with headquarters in Amsterdam, and Charles Caden, my executive editor at Alliance Magazine, who's joining us from London. Really quickly, if I could go around so that our listeners know what sort of publications. Obviously, we all cover philanthropy, but we do it in different ways. Michael, could you tell us a little bit quickly about the sort of issues you cover for Philanthropy Age?
Senior reporter for Inside Philanthropy.
Oh, sorry, Inside Philanthropy.
Correction.
God, sorry.
But that's okay. We're a website and newsletter covering, as our tagline has it, kind of who's funding what and why. And, most of our audience ranges from nonprofits, foundations, and others who work in the sector. And we're usually focused on US funders because the bulk of our audience is there, but we try to cover broadly. And that's the snapshot.
Okay, I also saw you cover climate. Is that sort of your niche inside philanthropy?
Yes, my beat would be climate philanthropy, environmental philanthropy writ large, though those are basically the same thing. I kind of have a sub-beat of covering billionaire philanthropy, and then again, that is kind of the same thing as climate philanthropy in many ways these days. And we get some free rein, so I'll cover things like impact investing or donor advised funds as well. We have the flexibility to jump into a lot of issues here at IP.
Okay, great. Well, I look forward to hearing more about that. Louise, can you tell us a little bit about Circle and Philanthropy?
Yes, so Philanthropy Age was set up a decade ago, initially with funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the idea was to give a platform for Arab philanthropists and Arab nonprofits to talk about their giving. In this region, there's a long tradition of deep-seated giving and culture. But traditionally, people haven't talked about it, and that comes down to a little bit of religion, people not wanting the left hand and the right hand to know what's happening. So, sorry, I can hear a voice in the background. So there's been sort of an evolution over the last decade or so to try and get people to talk about what they're doing, to try and give people the chance to talk about how they're doing things and to share ideas, because there was a problem. People were doing lots of amazing work, but not talking about it. So you might have 6 foundations supporting education, but nobody knew because they kept it so quiet. So we're a slightly different philanthropy sector because there's no tax or very little tax in this region. So people don't publish their work, they don't share what they're doing as much as openly, and that's part of what we're trying to advocate for, more transparency. But yeah, so that's what we do. Philanthropy Age is sort of a news platform, and then Circle is a new sister site, also funded by the Gates Foundation, and we're a resource hub, which is more for people within the sector. So it's more for foundation staff and next-gen donors with resources and how-to guides and sort of inspiring stories.
Okay, great. And if I understand correctly, you also have a background as a journalist.
Yes, my background is in Yeah, it's in foreign news reporting. So I've worked all over Africa and the Middle East, reporting for the BBC and Agence France Presse and different agencies. So that's my background. So it's less newsy, obviously, doing philanthropy, but it's still the storytelling aspect and bringing out those details and giving people more than just the jargon and trying to go beyond that sort of annual report style of coverage and give people more of a story that they can engage with.
Fantastic, great. And Bert.
Yes.
I have Bert here. Yes, Bert. So more, from what I understand, more of an academic background.
Yes, I'm a historian and a journalist. I'm working for philanthropy platform DDB, part of Amsterdam University Press. We are writing for
we are almost closing in case you want to grab more.
charitable funds and corporate foundations.
Okay, thank you for that. So the great thing about having all of you here is not only the geographic spread, but the variation in your experience. So we're going to Charles. I don't want to leave you out. From Alliance, if you can tell everybody what you do.
It's great to be here with our partners at Catalyst 2030 and part of this Catalyzing Change Week. So thank you to you for teaming up with Alliance. And so I am the executive editor of Alliance. I'm actually a foundation director turned philanthropy journalist. So I work with one of the billionaires that Michael now covers in the formative part of my career. But now I'm in a position where I get to cover in my capacity at Alliance what's happening in philanthropy worldwide. We aim to be a critical friend to the field, both serving the field, fostering the values of philanthropy and its development and civil society around the world, but also trying to hold the field to account, something I'm sure we'll come back to in the context of our conversation about philanthropy media and how well we can be both part of the field and apart from it, how well we can kind of hold up a mirror to the field, as well as encouraging it to do more and better given its great potential. And I've had the pleasure of and the privilege of editing Alliance for the last 7 or 8 years now. So really looking forward to this conversation and also, the development of the philanthropy media field outside of the US in particular is something that we're part of and watching enthusiastically. So it's really great to be here with colleagues from the UAE, from Holland, and from the US as well. So, and thank you to you, Charlotte, for moderating this conversation.
Thank you, Charles. I'm really looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts on various topics. So I guess the first one I would want to know from you guys, what are the main things in philanthropy right now? I know that when the layman opens, New York Times, we hear about Elon Musk making the news, or perhaps Bill Gates. But from your perspectives, what are the big topics right now that people are talking about in philanthropy? I guess because I started with Michael. Michael, I'll start with you again. Sorry to pick on you.
Happy to try to kick this off. I'm sure we all have different perspectives. Mine's deeply affected by my beat. I'll acknowledge that. It's deeply affected by what I cover. So I'll say that when thinking about this, I'm tempted to say billionaires, democratization and trust-based philanthropy, transparency. And then at the same time, I'd say the theme is what it's always been, which is rich people exercising power. And, individual philanthropists may do things out of, desire to change or desire to give back, etc. But ultimately, philanthropy is also an exercise of power, whether or not, whatever the intentions of the person doing it. These sums of money are, beggar kind of our understanding in many cases. So those 3 themes are have always been there, but they're certainly rising in my experience of the sector. Maybe transparency is less, it's on my mind, but maybe not everyone else. And then climate change, obviously biased due to my beat, but I feel like it's the thing that everyone's going to have to deal with one way or another, and philanthropy is no exception. So I think that's something that we're looking at. Obviously you can add things like democracy, etc. And there are many other areas of more particular to philanthropic funding and action strategy that are rising, whether it's equity, etc.
Great, thank you, Michael. Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in.
Yeah.
I'm based in the Arab region in Dubai, and we cover GCC countries and MENA and the Levant. And it's a region where there's a huge amount of need and a very strong nonprofit sector, and there's a lot of money given to the third sector, but it's not, it's quite different, I would say, to philanthropy exercised in North America and in Europe, and it's less talked about from the beginning, it's less well documented. So I think one of the big themes here is sort of sharing information and how people present themselves and how they talk about what they do, and there's still a hesitation for people in this region to talk about philanthropy because they feel that it's boasting or they shouldn't be saying things publicly. But we are seeing a really exciting emergence of a new generation coming through, and these are sort of second, third generation Arabs who've got 6 degrees. Their parents, grew up in very humble situation, and they've gone on to do 3 or all these qualifications, and they've studied and they've been to the Aspen Institute and they've had Gates Foundation training, and they're coming through with some really exciting new funding vehicles and impact investing ideas, a different focus, looking at gender, lots of different ideas. Social enterprises are really growing here in this region as a way forward. So I think for me, it's definitely, there is talk about trust-based philanthropy and there is talk about equity and a little bit of shift the power, but it's not really as much as you're seeing elsewhere. But I think the big theme here is what the next gen are going to do and how they're going to do it differently.
Okay, great. Thank you, Louise. That's an interesting perspective. Bert, can we hear from you? What do you think?
Yes.
Putting your academic hat on.
About the Dutch situation.
Yeah.
I think philanthropy in The Hague is rather invisible. That's a pity, because philanthropy, part of the civil society, can pick up issues the government and the market neglects or ignores. So that's a problem in Holland, and this insight has not properly penetrated public opinion. So that's a real problem. Secondly, charitable funds and corporate foundations can play a crucial role in the sustainability transition here in Holland. That's the main theme. So like the transitions in energy, agriculture, food, mobility, clothing, etc. And the sustainability reporting can make this process more transparent. So we're talking about the corporate sustainability reporting directive from Brussels, part of the Green Deal. I think these are 2 main themes in Holland at this moment.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bert. And Charles, any thoughts?
Well, just thinking back to what Michael was saying about how philanthropy is an exercise in power, and I think just as journalists, that is exactly the reason why scrutiny is so important, that whatever power is exercised in society, then one needs to be able to scrutinize its use, both as a force for good or ill. And therefore, that really does challenge the conventional notion that philanthropy is about doing good, and therefore what's not to like? We want to promote giving, we want more people to give, we want people to give better. But actually, if it's also about power, particularly when it's concentrated in the hands of those with the most resources, then yes, of course, you do want those people to give and to be generous and to be strategic in their approach, but also it shouldn't be immune to scrutiny. And what's interesting about the American conversation about philanthropy, from what I can see as an observer in the UK now, but having previously taught and studied in the US, is how much more critical the conversation has become in liberal circles, whereas many people look to America as this bastion for kind of free markets and for liberal thinking and philanthropy. And it is true that in the US there is more giving per capita than others. Critical conversation happening. And then over to what Louise was saying, just thinking about the next generation. We were together in Dubai. I was over in the UAE last week the week before last for the AVPN Global Conference, but I was able to hit another speaker generation philanthropy in the UAE, and it does seem like there is a generational shift towards a more strategic approach to philanthropy underway, and it will be very interesting to see where that takes us. One thing I would ask, though, and it's partly as a result of my experience in recent weeks going there, is sometimes it's hard in the UAE to understand where state money, royal money, and private money begins and ends. And I think in terms of that transparency point, it would be really helpful to understand when, for example, announcements are made by the UAE when it's governmental and when they're philanthropic, or at least to help those of us not in the region understand the differences. And also to the extent to which the media, where you are, including yourselves, are free to report and to scrutinise on it, and indeed to scrutinise on the people that fund you, like the Gates Foundation. A question we have at Alliance, because our funding model relies both on subscriptions, advertising, and sponsorships for events, but it also relies on philanthropic support. So to what extent are we able to both scrutinise the people that fund us? So those are two questions I would pose both to Louise, but also to ourselves in terms of how we navigate those challenges where we are. Thank you, Sean.
Yep. Louise, do you have any thoughts you want to jump in there?
Yeah, no, we can come back on the government versus private money. I mean, that's a big question that we all have here. It can be difficult to differentiate when you've got royal funded foundations, or you've got, for instance, there were some very big pledges made at AVPN by Reaching the Last Mile, which is the personal philanthropy fund of the president of the UAE, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed. So it can be a bit difficult. And often with Ramadan funding, we have these huge campaigns where lots of people will commit billions and billions of dirham, and you're not really sure if it's coming from, when it comes from the RTA, which is a government-owned transport authority, is that philanthropy or is that a government donation? So that is a bit unclear. In terms of freedom to report, it's a work in progress. We're trying all the time. I think there's slowly developing a better understanding of why the transparency is helpful and why people should be clearer about where money is coming from. I think it's still a work in progress. So yeah, but it can be challenging to understand what's philanthropy and what's state funding, particularly when you look at overseas funding for the Gaza crisis, for instance. And this region's always very generous, supporting natural disasters and conflict issues. They've given a lot to the Syrian refugee crisis, to Yemen, to Gaza, and most recently to Sudan. And you'll see things referred to as philanthropy, but it's come from the overseas development. You know, is it ODA? Is it philanthropy? Sometimes it's not that clear to see exactly what it is.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Louise. Jumping on the back of that, what issues do you think are not getting the coverage that they deserve in philanthropy, if any?
That to me?
Yeah, I'll give it to anyone who wants
okay.
to. Is there anything you think that the sector should be covering more that we're not?
I'm going to let Charles take that if you want to.
You jump in, and others be interested in others' views on this, and also people who are listening in today. I'd love to hear what you've got to say in the chat, and then we can maybe respond to that. But for me, one big issue for philanthropy, and therefore for philanthropy media, is about the health of the media and civil society. It's an area that, in my view, is being grossly underfunded in general by foundations and philanthropy. And I think we need more strategic liberal foundations willing to fund the health and well-being of civil society through investments in the media in general, not the philanthropy media, rather than just philanthropists owning the media. And in the US, you know, again, there is some real progress compared to what I'm seeing elsewhere. $500 million initiative from, I think, 18 foundations pressed forward to invest in the health of democracy and civil society through funding local media. But we don't have anything like that in the rest in the UK or the rest of Europe for what conversations I'm having. So I see us Alliance as having a responsibility wherever there are opportunities to highlight this critical need for anyone concerned about the health and well-being of democracy to think about funding media, public interest media, in a really careful and thoughtful way to support that, because state funding has declined, and obviously media's faced huge disruption. So it's a slightly self-referential answer, but it is something that I think has been less maybe a focus than it might have been, alongside climate issues of inequality and other issues.
Just so that listeners understand, in the UK, Charles, can you clarify? Paul Marshall, he owns what percentage? What big titles are owned by?
Yeah, so this is an example of the problematic role that philanthropy can play. So yeah, there's a philanthropist called Paul Marshall who has a Sequoia Trust, which is a major investor in the LSE. They've got the Marshall Institute, but he's also been a major funder of Brexit, a major funder of GD News, which is a radical right media platform, Unheard, another platform in the running to buy the Telegraph. That's not the kind of philanthropy that I'm talking about. I think that is kind of muscular radical right philanthropy. What I'm talking about is foundations, like, for example, the MacArthur Foundation Board and others, that see a problem with the polarization and issues with the lack of a kind of public interest media, or the failures, market failures, and thinking about how to rebuild that in a transparent way. That is part of the problem of philanthropy, that it can be a very powerful force for good or for ill, depending on your political viewpoint.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Charles. Michael, be interested to hear from you covering climate. Are there any issues you think that on your beat that are not getting the coverage normally that they deserve?
You know, I think I don't want to resist the question, but I would say, like, all of us within our beats can look and say there's 100 more things that I wish were covered. I think the baseline for this question is that philanthropy media is very small. It has a limited amount of resources. Many of those resources come from philanthropy, which is, as we've been discussing, whether it's at least a reputational challenge. I'm tempted to say, like, there's a lot of areas that I don't know about that probably do deserve coverage. I think I'm almost more interested in, like, the fact that there's it's very difficult and rare to do very deep, in-depth coverage about kind of the different connections between philanthropy and other things. One area I see in the US would be, like, the role that philanthropy plays with government, and kind of interrogating that deeply. And probably philanthropy media is not actually the best and most well-resourced place to do that, but we see some good investigations of that through outlets like ProPublic or even individual news outlets, and sometimes that's even funded by philanthropy, ironically. So maybe that's a case for a lack of reputational concern. But yeah, I think it's hard to answer this question because there is such a broad range. I mean, I'm not sure how much, say, impact investment coverage there is. I don't see that within, the philanthropy media I cover, and not sure how much it's covered within the business news. I think, that's a burgeoning area. It could have been added to the issues. And so, like, to what extent is that covered and how? So I feel like we're mostly in the dark grabbing what we can, and there's a lot of things that could be covered that aren't, and it's just a very rich place. And if any young journalists listening, I'd say jump in, because there's a lot to cover that isn't being covered.
I think going back to your original comment, Michael, about how philanthropy is in many cases about power makes this sector particularly tricky to cover. I think, as Charles said, that people who exercise great power and think they're doing, we all know that if someone does something bad, they probably deserve press coverage. But when someone tries really, really hard to do well and doesn't do it very well, that nobody likes criticism when they're putting their best foot forward, and that can be very tricky inside when you're covering philanthropy. But for Bert, from where you are in the Netherlands, what do you think? You study this. What do you think is not getting coverage?
Yeah, an important issue is whether philanthropy delivers on its promise. So we are talking about the social agreement with society. Is philanthropy effective? That's the main theme here in Holland. Because unlike the profits, the non-profits do not have the pressure from the shareholders. So that's a problem to be effective, and to have a wake-up call sometimes. So that would be my answer to this question.
Great, thank you, Bert. So this is kind of criticism of ourselves. How can philanthropy media, how can we do a better job covering this sector? I mean, I know Charles and I have often said, if we had infinite resources, all the things we would like to cover. But unfortunately, no newspaper has all the journalists and the budget it would like to have. But given those constraints, do you guys have any thoughts about how we could do a better job covering the sector?
And I'd come back and I put money under this question. That's my answer to this, is money. We need more funding so we can have that time and space. And what you mentioned, Charles, about the ecosystem. And in this region, people are very funny about funding overhead. They like just to only fund the project. They don't like to give money to the wider NGO doing work. So there's a lot of resistance to funding the ecosystem. So so I think it's that finding that balance, isn't it, between holding up a mirror to show what people are doing in a positive way that's inspiring and encouraging without beating them around the head. So like you say, if somebody does something with a good intention, they don't do it that well, sometimes it can feel a bit, you know, childish to sort of beat them over the head and say, you didn't do it very well at all. But I guess it's that way of finding a way to talk about failure or to talk about lessons in a sort of sensible way that people can learn from. Because I think there's this resistance talking about what's gone wrong, because people see philanthropy as a passion or as a hobby. They don't like to be scrutinized, and particularly in this region. I know it's different overseas, but yeah, so it just, yeah, that would be my area.
I think that's a good point, Louise. No one likes to be criticized, I think, anywhere. But
yeah,
it's a tightrope for us to walk, of how, as the name of Charles, not meaning to plug Charles's excellent column, but Critical Friend, how do we walk that tightrope of gently calling people out, while at the same time not sounding condescending and maintaining their concentration on the sector? Charles, do you have any thoughts on this?
Serve the field and critique it at the same time is an ongoing challenge. I do share what Louise's perspective on that. At the same time, if we worked in politics or we're political journalists, we'd have no hesitation critiquing, calling out failures, challenging weakness. That would be precisely conceived of our job. So, you know, in this clubbable philanthropy world, actually where there's much less scrutiny from shareholders or electorates, maybe it's even more important that philanthropy media can have a slightly sharper edge, albeit one that ultimately wants to serve the field to do better by ventilating debates. So in answer to your question, I would say for us at Alliance, we try to cover what's happening in philanthropy worldwide, and we certainly have a kind of global orientation to our coverage, but we are still UK based, albeit with representatives around the world, increasing our networks, insights, sources. And we can scarcely do justice to the developments and the context of philanthropy in different geographic regions of the world. So I think a big part of Alliance's mandate in the coming years will be to improve our coverage of what's happening in philanthropy in those parts of the world. I can see in the chat, Rose has mentioned Africa. Some of the most interesting developments in philanthropy are happening across the African continent. And we do try to highlight what's happening, interview the key people and protagonists, discuss some of the big debates, particularly around decolonization and power and the relationship of philanthropy to international development. But we've got a long way to go. The second area, which is related to the first but separate, is trying to bring previously excluded voices and include them within the philanthropy conversation, which our own DEI audit highlighted that we have progress that we need to make on that. And that's why we've established an inclusion fund to actually pay writers to submit copy in their own languages, and also for those, say, frontline grassroots groups that can't really afford the time to participate in our kind of esoteric philanthropy debates, actually being able to pay them to contribute, so that we can broaden the philanthropy conversation away from some of the more elite elements, to hear those voices. And I think, again, we need to do better at picking up those voices and making sure there's a market incentive to allow them to end up on our platform. So room for progress and growth there as well.
In the comments, someone has mentioned, Matthew, the philanthropy agenda is still not centering and being led by the voices of the communities they serve. What is philanthropy media's role in shining a light on this issue? I think that's a really good question, Matthew. It's one I thought of in Bogota in December when I went to the Shift the Power Summit, but that was something I heard a lot, that those who are most affected are not being heard. So as Charles mentioned, we do have our inclusion fund where we're trying to broaden voices, but I think that's an issue, not just in philanthropy media, but in media in general, that those who are most affected, that journalists tend to come from certain demographic backgrounds that don't necessarily represent their readership. So thank you, Matthew, for that comment. My next question is one that's been on my mind. Oh, sorry, Michael, jump in. Yes.
I'd love to jump in on this one.
Yeah.
Quickly to Matthew's comment. Yeah, I mean, we all need to diversify our staffs to add on different voices, to bring those in through contributors. Not wanting to make assumptions about my fellow panelists, but we seem to be a group of certain representation. So that's part of our role. But coming to kind of covering the sector, you know, beyond who we are, when I came into media, I was previously at a philanthropy network, Grant Makers Conservative Immigrants and Refugees. And, you know, my experience there, my experience subsequently as a freelancer, as a consultant, I think there's, like in any field, there's a difference between what people say privately and what debates are aired publicly. And my work as a journalist is to try to bridge that gulf, you know, to try to bring some of those critiques that everyone's talking about, but it doesn't always come out in media. And I think one thing about that is that we have an increasing number of critiques publicly that are about issue X or funding topic Y, but getting specific about a particular foundation and what they're doing, and then talking to that foundation and asking why they're doing it that way. That's the role we can play. Like, grantees can't do that. They can't always have that kind of dialogue. We have that role and that responsibility, in my view. And so it's a lot harder. It's a lot more work. It's much more difficult to bring those pieces all together. But to the extent we can, that's the difference between the critique we see a lot in philanthropy, which is much more broad-based and general and doesn't mention very many names, and then one that does and actually engages also with those names and their motivations and their reasons, and tries to understand where they're all coming from. And that's like the hardest type of journalism, but it's more powerful. And then I'll just do a quick kind of promotion of social math. I feel like sometimes we don't kind of put these numbers, these big numbers, in context of what they actually mean for the donor, which is actually often quite little. You know, whether it's in relation to most often this is in relation to the donor, but sometimes social math can help kind of contextualize a figure that someone is giving that is both big for the field but very minor for that donor.
Right. Thank you, Michael. I see Stephen. Because the way my screen is, I have a very small screen, but I can't see Stephen. Stephen, wherever you are, do you want to jump in? I see you have your hand up.
Hello, yeah. Well, I suppose I should introduce what I am. Basically, only in the last 3 years, me and my partner have stepped into being philanthropists. Previously journalist and previously a teacher. And through, you know, unfortunately, the demise of her father a few years back, we've now created a foundation. So we've kind of got a foot in two camps, that we've stepped into this space from a blank sheet and we're learning how to be philanthropists. And so far, listening to the collective here, I'd like to start with a question. How many people in this group are giving away their own money? Either from their family or from themselves. And if you can, by a show of hands, put up how many people are deciding to give away money to try and help this planet. I don't see any hands yet. If you are giving away your own money, if you actually are choosing to give away money to try and help causes around the world, put your hand up. Just show of hands, you know, the little reaction thing down the bottom. Oh, I got one. All right, so one other person. Oh, there's a few there. Okay, I'm glad there are a few here. I noticed none of them have spoken yet. One of the things is the first thing we did is we started learning how to be philanthropists. Was, you know, we stepped into this from a blank sheet, and it's incredibly hard to give away money. It may make some of you laugh, but it was the first pat phrase I started saying. And that is, you've got a big pile of money, you go, I want to do good. And you start trying to work out how to do it well. And you start talking to people about it. And then they start having an opinion on how you should and what you should and shouldn't do. And then I did a course with the AVPN to learn how to be a philanthropist and learn the good strategies in order to do it effectively, in order to support my partner in us doing it effectively so we don't waste this private wealth we've inherited. Listening in the last, half an hour to all of you talking, and how can I put it, Charles, you seem to have a grudge against the world a little bit. I know you're trying to balance through alliance, but you have a probably a built cynicism. I've been in this space for a couple of years. I know a fraction of what you do, and you've already got a groundswell of cynicism about power, money, capitalism, who's got it, who's wielding it, and why. And that sort of rhetoric is going to stop people giving. We're in a place that already we've been in this space long enough to realize that it's hard. It's hard from this side to learn how to do it. And we ask everybody, and my missus is a journalist, and we look for 360-degree input into what's going on and what people want. And even that, it took 2 years of research, and we're just focusing on animal welfare. And it took 2 years of research, a couple of 100,000, just to learn what everybody was talking about so we can understand the space we're trying to help. Now, you're all collectively so far been talking about what could go wrong, what needs to be done, the transparency that needs to be put in place. And what you do is you slowly kill off people wanting to share because you're all making it far more complicated than it should be. So as far as what's not been talked about so far is how to make philanthropy fun for people that are choosing to give it away. The fun comes from celebrating the successes. We're currently sitting in Washington, D.C. at the moment at the start of a 2-week learning journey with one of the big Singaporean philanthropy circles. And we're sitting down with all the great and the good. We're at State Department this afternoon. We were with the ambassador of Singapore yesterday evening, talking very frankly about this. And these are the people trying to give the money away. So because we were learning, we started Philanthropy Asia, which is launching this summer, which is an information hub by a philanthropist for philanthropists to try and help them enjoy giving away their money. For a lot of philanthropists, it's just like going shopping. You want to feel good, so you walk into a shop where there's lots of causes and you decide where to give the money away that's going to bring you the most joy and most satisfaction and the most sense of well-being. And that, from the philanthropist point of view, is the thing that gets worn down if all that's done is the philanthropy sector is prodded and poked. So, we want to enjoy this privilege that we've got of having money to give to causes and to support change and support things. The only one I do like is that you were saying celebrating some of the successes, and there's been a few balanced comments about good and bad. And I know there's lots of bad things, but there's a lot of good as well. Philanthropy is mostly set out with an intention of good. But so far, the conversations have been about how do we dress the balances of the wielded power of the great and many wealthy people of the world. But a lot of philanthropy is people like ourselves just trying to enjoy making a difference. And if the media goes in the direction that this conversation's gone so far, we'll just go off and do it quietly without sharing it with anybody. Philanthropy Asia is trying to put the fun back into philanthropy, the celebration of the good, the celebration of what's going well. So, if Charles, with right of response, wants to talk about how much Alliance celebrates the great versus celebrates the problems, I think we need a 60-40 split of the good that's happening. So far, I do believe that we can dance further and faster in philanthropy than corporates can with stewardship. So I'd like to see more support for philanthropists being philanthropists, because that would be nice, and then more of it would happen and we might share more with you. Charles, your turn.
Keep for that challenge and provocation. I mean, that's what this conversation is all about. And I think from Alliance point of view, it's about both the serving the field, also critiquing it. We don't always get that balance right. But if we don't critique it, and we don't critique it, I don't think philanthropy can improve. And that's why it's important that you have feedback loops, you have accountability, you have mechanisms for dialogue. And that's what part of a media is supposed to do. If it doesn't do that role, then you don't have the independence, you don't have the independent analysis. So I wouldn't apologize for our critique. I think the debates we have is whether we're critical enough, whether we're too critical or not, or not critical enough. And that is a real delicate balance. What we do to, if you like, make sure that it is not us making a decision about or answering that question, as we have hundreds of practitioners who contribute on our platform every year. So it's not just the opinions of me or the editorial team that we hear, but the vast majority of our coverage and content is actually generated from the fields of practitioners. And we'd invite you to contribute your views, however critical they are, even about ourselves. That's part of the healthy debate and dialogue that we need in order to make progress. But where there is power, there should be scrutiny. And I think that has been a really important insight that we've really derived from the American conversation, from our friends, colleagues at Inside Philanthropy and other publications in America, where there's a very robust debate that's happening. And that's how I think one learns, by having the confidence and the kind of ability to wrestle with different ideas and competing claims. That's, I think, how we move forward. So I take your point. I think there is a lot to be celebrated as well. We're not here, we are here to celebrate the value that philanthropy contributes to civil society and society more generally, but we're not only there to be in celebratory mode. That's not media, that's PR. And there's plenty of PR firms that you can work with to promote your messages. But the point about a media is to be able to critique, but to do so in a constructive way. And I believe that, broadly speaking, we would take a constructive approach. We do have a lot of feedback that's saying we sometimes too soft, too generous, not critical enough. Others like yourself might say we're too critical, but that is a judgment that we have to rightly make as part of the editorial team. And I hope we can persuade you of that in due course by looking at the kind of full spectrum of our work and what we do.
Thank you, Charles. Bert, I'll go to you in a second, but just to reply to Stephen quickly, I am the commissioning editor at Alliant. So if you just to follow up on what Charles said, that we do enjoy healthy debate. I personally don't agree with everything you said, but I would be happy to publish an op-ed from you that would generate responses from what you just said. So by all means, you can find me online, send me an email, be happy to publish, work with you on that. Bert, you had your hand up.
Yes, I think you can be a credible friend. You must be and must stay. But also you can write about the practitioners themselves and write about the best practice in this sector. And I think that's an important thing for us to do. Yes.
Michael, yes.
I guess two things. I'm fascinated by a notion that people with more money than they can spend themselves would be dissuaded by media coverage from using that money to save lives or improve other people's lives. Like that, to me, it's hard to understand. It's hard to follow that logic. There's an abundance of ways to do this, and and then the second part is, there is an enormous amount of coverage of philanthropy. Nearly all of it is positive. There's an enormous amount of coverage of best practices, etc. That's what philanthropy excels at generating. I think it's a widely known critique and recognition within this the entire sector that we struggle to follow those cases where funding went awry or where there's debate and conflict. And that's one role for media. And I'm also struck that you found it worthwhile to, as you said, you were a newcomer, you just spent 5 or so minutes of everybody's time to talk about your experience in a forum for philanthropy media, which is, a different topic than, the beginning of a family foundation. So I'm struck by that sense of your belief in your perspective. That surprises me.
Can't hear you.
I am unmuted now, sorry. So this is a big question I did want to ask all of you, which I spend a lot of time on public transport contemplating. Who in philanthropy do you think has the most potential to shape the sector, either for better or for worse? Louise, I know you are funded by Gates, and one of the first questions Charles asked me in my interview with him was, who do you think is the biggest philanthropist? And apparently a lot of people said Bill Gates. So I'd be interested to hear from you. Who do you think, with your perspective as a journalist now working in philanthropy, who do you think is really shaping the sector?
I mean, Yeah, the Gates Foundation does a lot of ecosystem building. They're one of the big funders. They're doing a lot in India, a lot in the Arab region. They're expanding the foundation. Obviously, Melinda French Gates is doing more of the gender side, and Bill's doing more of the public health side. So there's a lot. They're doing a lot, and they are putting a lot into philanthropy media. So they're definitely playing a role. I think they do have a sort of a seed and leave approach. So they tend to get things started and then they like to let other people take over. So I don't think we should see them as the only funders. I am interested to see obviously the emergence of Mackenzie Scott and how she's funding a lot more civil society organizations, and some of those, are, working in media. So that's changing things. I think it's never just going to be a handful of people. I think it's such a diverse sector and it crosses so many different borders and different issues that there's so many different people involved. I think for me in this region, I think it's the new generation, and they're going to really change how it comes across, because they're a lot more open to transparency and they're a lot more open to talking about what they're doing. So I think there'll be a shift change over the next sort of 5 to 10 years over how people talk about their giving in this part of the world.
Thank you, Louise. Any other thoughts from you guys, Bert, Michael, or Charles, about who do you think is really shaping the sector at the moment?
Yes.
Yeah, Bert.
I think the supervisors and the directors of the big charitable funds and corporate foundations can play a very important role, but they also can be more transparent about their agenda and their goals. And that's a point in my region, I suppose.
Yeah, great.
It was mentioned, Mackenzie Scott. I mean, I really think that what she has done has really opened up a extraordinary conversation about how hard it is to do good. Having worked for a philanthropist for over a decade, I always did feel like it was referred to that it is hard to do good, to make good decisions, to be purposeful, to be responsible. Sometimes we'd even be frustrated at the critical media coverage or the lack of interest from the media. So I can understand from a foundation perspective, a philanthropist perspective, sometimes being frustrated. But actually, what Mackenzie Scott has done is she's inverted that. And she's actually been able to suggest that actually it's not as hard as one might think to spend large amounts of money and trust the people that you're giving the money to after some basic due diligence that they have their partners doing to give. What's also been remarkable about Scott's giving, and this is more about funding practice, is about the lack of reporting requirements, the lack of burden that's imposed on the grantee once the funds are out the door. So you've got the scale of funding being huge and transformational for a grantee. You've got no reporting requirements or limited reporting requirements. And then the direction of that funding to causes that have been previously neglected, social justice causes, whether this is about women's funds in the global south, or about historically black colleges and universities, or about marginalized groups, really with a focus on social justice, which has been a remarkable statement of intent. But to Michael's point, that actually there can be a difference between the conversation you're hearing and the one that is in public. And we do hear foundation CEOs who are critical privately of Mackenzie Scott because they feel that she will free ride on the expertise that they bring through the program officers that they employ and the staff of the foundations and the professional foundations, and there's a degree of frustration that she can imbalance ecosystems through the sheer weight of resources. So for us at Alliance, what's the story there? The story is you've got extraordinary women doing something very different in terms of our philanthropy, but also there's a story or a subtext around how comfortable, how are the foundations that have been doing things in more orthodox ways responding to that, and that is a story that's hard to get people to go on the record about. I wonder if other panelists have got their views on that, but Mackenzie Scott to me would be the standout philanthropist that I'm seeing.
I also added, sorry, just to clarify this question, it's not just for good, it's also who for bad. If anyone also thinks that sometimes who's steering, when we think about philanthropy, I know, Charles, you just wrote, again, a plug for your column, your critical friend column about Elon Musk, who is often making headlines.
At the beginning of this conversation about Paul, you asked me about Paul Marshall. I mean, I think I would say that, yeah, he's done in some ways good in terms of contribution to development of philanthropy through his gifts to the LSE. But from my point of view, from a progressive perspective, someone that's been bankrolling GB News, along with Christopher Chandler at the Garton Foundation, is contributing to the discourse in the UK that has been very toxic and has really been about, in some ways, it's really hurting those that are most vulnerable in our society. So it's a legitimate form of philanthropy, but it's a more muscular form. It's not so much about giving up power as exerting it. And that's, again, another reason why there needs to be coverage of philanthropy. There needs to be a philanthropy media to look at these questions. And there might be some that will come to different conclusions, but that about the qualities of those philanthropists. But that's exactly why you need to have media, is to mediate these conversations.
Right, thank you, Charles. I think we've got time for one last question. What do you guys think the public doesn't understand about philanthropy? Any thoughts on that? Yes, Bert.
Yes, I think philanthropy as part of the civil society can be a third power near the market and the government. I think the public doesn't always understand the potential of this. So we are writing about this subject in Holland because if you have to do without the charities and volunteers, I think the country would come to a screeching and grinding halt. Yes.
Interesting. Thank you, Bert. Yeah, Louise.
I'd written down to this question, what do philanthropists not understand about philanthropy?
That's a good
because
way
I think
of phrasing
there's
it,
such
yes.
a wide spectrum of experiences and focuses, and we've heard Stephen's point of view and how he sees it as a hobby and wanting to keep that joy, and then people take it very seriously or they run it like a business, not as a social impact, because ultimately the people that you're giving the money to, they should be the most important people in it. It's not about the joy for the person who's giving the money, it's people who are receiving the money whose lives are being uplifted. So I think the public understand that people do good, but I think, again, that comes down to what do we help them understand? How much do we shine a spotlight on those aspects of power? People might not know how powerful people like Paul Marshall are and how much they're funding different things. They might see his name on the LSE Institute and think that's wonderful, but they may not have a grasp of GB News and what that means. So it is, I guess, up to us to help the public understand more.
Right, fantastic. Michael, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think our coverage, I think my colleagues' coverage here, it's always focused on the big, powerful players. When you're a small family foundation and you're doing your own thing and you're taking your time, like, I have no issue with that. That's your game. But when you're operating at a scale that is so much more resources than, say, an individual US state or an individual US city uses in a year, you deserve a lot of scrutiny and a lot of investigation. And you may be operating with the very best intentions. I'm sure people like Bill Gates, their vision for the world is one of change, and with that amount of money, you're going to save an enormous number of lives. The question is the structures that you're building, how do those, do they empower other people, and in what ways are those other people chosen? I think to the question of whether the public what they don't understand about philanthropy, sometimes I think, at least talking to Americans, other people I know, that they understand it sometimes better than some of the media does, in that, most people assume philanthropy is about reputation and power. And that, for the biggest groups, that can be true. There's a whole other smaller section of philanthropy that, can be something that's wonderful that you do at the end of your life. A lot of our press coverage is about the people who have so much power that it changes what school districts do. It changes what health systems do. It changes what, all kinds of sectors of society do, because they come in and they push governments one way or the other way with money that's flexible. And being able to interrogate that, and or at least map that and map those successes too. I recently wrote a piece about how philanthropy helped contribute to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund in the US. That is largely a success story. There is also things to be questioned there. Like, these can be simultaneous events. And I think that the public sometimes knows that philanthropy is about power and reputation. And sometimes even myself, forget about that because we're focused on trying to, understand what's being funded. And I think it's important to keep that as an aspect. It's not the entire story, but it also should never be left out.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I think we've only got about 4 minutes left. Just want to go through the comments quickly from you guys. There are a few that spoke to me. So someone mentioned, speaking of women and philanthropy, there isn't enough talk about the particular needs of feminist-oriented organizations and how traditional funding structures often don't meet their needs. I think that's a very good point. I think that comment came up when we were discussing Mackenzie Scott. And second, we've got another one. And there were comments earlier, I think, to Stephen's interjection about the concept of philanthropy being fun. I think that was a very interesting choice of words. One of the things I've learned I'm very new to philanthropy, I've only been here for about 6 months, is the weight of responsibility, and that with philanthropy and how much money you have, for some people, everyone can be a philanthropist. We can all, hopefully, when you had a show of hands, a lot of hands went up. Philanthropy doesn't just have to be billionaires, it can be all of us. But when you are giving, you are playing with other people's lives. And that does come with responsibility. And I think the important thing about all of us here on this panel is how do we critique that responsibility and hold it accountable? And as Charles said, it is a tight rope to walk for all of us. So I will hand it back to Catalyst. I want to thank you all for an interesting conversation. I've learned a lot from all of you, and I hope this can be a discussion going forward.
Okay.
Great discussions. Thank you, Charlotte, for leading the discussion. I'd like to present a few things from Catalyst. Yes, so I'd like to invite you all, if you know a social innovator or government or donor who's working towards building the social innovation sector, feel free to nominate them for the Catalyst Awards. That will be happening in November.
So this is in line with the conversation we just had. We had a whole debate on who's a good funder, who's shifting the narrative, very passionate. So please join some of the nominations of people that you think that might resonate, that might be relevant, that we might not know about. So this is a good circle to share that with. And I think that would be important in to share that. That's why we highlighted it. Thank you so much. Continue on.
Okay, thank you. So I'm putting in the chat a link to nominate and learn more if you'd like to learn more. We also have Catalyst Market. Catalyst Market is along the line of this conversation as well. People who are working towards ensuring and promoting the social innovation sector through entrepreneurship. So this is your chance to support the call as philanthropists. So I invite you to go on to Catalyst Market now and shop something for a common good. So we've launched Ask Catalyst, which is a WhatsApp support buddy that's always there to answer your questions any time of the day and at any hour. So feel free to text this number if you have any questions about what Catalyst is and what we are doing. The link to the number is in the chat as well. We invite you all to also join us at Catalyst. We are a movement of social entrepreneurs and innovators who are working to promote sustainability through the SDGs. So I can see very interesting comments in the chat. So this is your chance to join us in building the social innovation sector. So we have a link in the chat to this as well. Would also love to know what you think about this session and the CCW in general so far. So would really love your feedback on it, and we'll have the link in the chat as well. And thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to hand it back to Charlotte.
Great.
And feel free to tag us as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Winifred. Really appreciated speaking to all of you. It's been a great session. Enjoy the bank holiday for those of you who
Thanks,
haven't.
everyone.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks.